Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. My name is Marcus Grodi, your host for this weekly program. Each week I have the privilege of introducing to you men and women who were guided by our Lord Jesus. The Holy Spirit touched their hearts and minds to discover maybe a church they never ever thought of seeking, and maybe they had to work through some barriers, some anti-Catholic barriers to understand the beauty of the church, maybe working through the bad images of the way they've experienced the church in their path. Well, it's often the case of our guests. And our guest for tonight is Nicole DeMille, former Lutheran. And so Nicole, welcome to The Journey Home.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
It's good to have you here on the program. And as you may be familiar with this program, I like to start.
It was key to my conversion.
Oh, well, great. I didn't know that. I'd love to ask you to let the audience know where you come from. So take a long step back and begin at the beginning and what kind of spiritual formation you had.
Okay, well, the very beginning is the earliest that most of us start our religious formation, which was in school. I was in Lutheran schools from kindergarten on and brought to church from little up. And Lutheranism was really what I knew. It was ingrained in the family, in our friends. My father was a church organist for the Lutheran Church. And going to Lutheran schools, it was Lutheran all day and Lutheran on Sunday.
I remember, because I was brought up Lutheran also, that you almost think of yourself as Lutheran as opposed to Christian. I mean,
yes.
You really are
certainly.
Lutheran.
I would not have labeled myself a Christian maybe ever until I was a married woman and started really seeking around and looking around and saying, Lutheranism is starting to change, which has even happened more so now in recent days. But as I saw that changing, I would look into other things: Episcopal, fundamentalist, charismatic, evangelical, different names and labels, what everybody else was marketing. And at that point, maybe I would have said to some people if they asked me, well, I was raised Lutheran, but I'm Christian. But all my life, it was Lutheran.
I mean, you certainly
first.
would have, just to make sure we don't misrepresent Lutherans. I mean, Lutherans obviously are Christians. That's not the question. But in terms, often I remember as a Lutheran, that meant to me my identity as a Christian, as opposed to just Christianity in general.
Yeah,
and you
and
really
there was
saw
a certain
yourself as a Lutheranism.
Pride of place there, a certain, that's what we were, and pride in the figure of Martin Luther. I went to a high school called Martin Luther High School, and there was a certain pride. You don't get more Lutheran than that when you're going to Martin Luther High School. Yeah. And so that's really what it was all about for me. And I loved liturgy for that reason. I was very accustomed to church done liturgically with 2 readings and communion. And that was what I knew and
singing
what I loved.
Singing Clean Heart, O God, every Sunday,
absolutely.
Right? That was a big part. I remember that as a child.
Absolutely.
Yeah. When you look back at yourself as a young woman, were you a believing, praying?
I was very devout from a very young age, almost preternaturally devout. My 5th grade teacher, Miss McGrath, told my mother, and now these are the things that are sort of prefigurements where you look back before your conversion, and she said to my mother, it's too bad there's no such thing as nuns in the Lutheran Church, because your little girl at 10 is so devout and so dedicated already. And I remember even before that, maybe my daughter's age now, 7, 8 years old, really sitting in church and welling up with emotion early on and just saying, this is for me. This is it. I just never doubted all through, from little to today, never doubted Jesus, the package surrounding that, always just a feeling that carried me through everything. So I was definitely gifted with a strong faith, and for a reason, because later on in life I was really going to need that for some things that ended up happening.
Now, in your unique Lutheran upbringing, again, I remember my own, though, was it in comparison to other Christian groups? Was that a part of your formation? So you understood your Lutheranism versus other Protestant groups? And particularly, what about in relationship to the Catholic Church?
Yes, I was really taught, and not in a hostile way, but taught that Lutherans were true Protestants. We protested against the Catholic Church and indulgences and corruption and not being allowed to read the Bible. And so now we were great.
So more of a matter of fact.
Yeah, it was just the way it was.
Historical, this is the way you understood history.
And I understood that there weren't Catholics running around now selling indulgences in the streets. I didn't think this was still, this medieval group out to get me. But and I was really never anti-Catholic. It just didn't come into my line of sight. Really in my peripheral vision did it exist as a thing, as a phenomenon.
Or something to join.
It never would have occurred to me, honestly, and didn't occur to me even at times in my life when I would church shop.
Did you have Catholic friends? You grew up in New York, right? Is the area you grew up?
I knew a lot of Catholics, but many were lapsed Catholics, cafeteria Catholics, lukewarm Catholics. And even to date, I would say I've had more anti-Catholicism thrown at me from Catholics, sadly, and it pains me to say that now as a Catholic woman and a Catholic mom, than any other group, really saying to me, well, you'll see, this is why they lose people, and this is a doctrine that no one can accept, or, well, this is hypocrisy, and things like that. But the Protestants I knew were not particularly anti-Catholic. It just didn't really come onto the radar, other than learning that history that we spoke about a few minutes ago. It really didn't come onto the radar. Our Lutheran school would compete in sports against some Catholic schools. They were kids, we were kids. It really didn't come onto the radar at all. And then when you started dating life, maybe it came a little bit onto the radar. Well, is he is that a Lutheran boy that you're dating? And that was really about it.
Did your faith then shape you as you left home and went beyond high school, or were you strong all the way through high school?
Always, yeah, really always strong ties to my mom. She really kept it alive for me in a lot of ways. I had a godmother who was a true godmother. I have memories of her tattered old Bible and tracts, which now I look back and I think a lot of them were chick tracts, which are probably some anti-Catholic ones thrown in there, but I didn't see those. But
you wouldn't have thought about it. You would have thought this is history.
No, it just would have gone, again, not relevant to me at the time. But I knew I was Protestant, knew I was Lutheran. Lutheran Church was a big part of my life, and it always stuck with me. I knew I was going to be a teacher. I wanted to be a teacher, and it was always a consideration for me. Will I teach in a Lutheran school? Because I went to Lutheran schools. That was always something I looked at when making life decisions.
Were you thinking that was your trajectory to end up in teaching?
I wanted it to be. I did become a teacher in the public schools eventually, but that was always a consideration when I made my decisions. How would my religious life fit into the other parts of my life?
So you said earlier that all of a sudden you started looking around a little bit.
Yeah,
when did that start?
I would say that happened when I was teaching in public school, and I sort of started living my life in a different way. Moved in with my husband before we were married, so making a bold move out of what I knew was right and into, well, maybe this is okay, and rationalized it to myself.
Well, let's talk about that, because that would have been contrary to your Lutheran upbringing. So it sounds like you had also gone through some mental shifts by the time that would come along. Yeah, well, again, now in retrospect, I would say without a very strict dogma, without a church interpreting the Bible, and with other forces coming in and helping you interpret what you read, and with individual interpretation still being something that I believed in, I could tell myself, well, I'm going to get married to him. We're betrothed, kind of, so this is okay. And so that was the first move. And, like I always say, everything is self-perpetuating. Everything gathers speed as it goes. So, what you feed will grow and what you starve will die. So if you feed these sort of explorations into the secular, that's where you're going to start your whole life. It's like when you're learning to drive and they say, well, don't look too far to the left because your car will veer that way.
That's
There you
true of life. When you take your eyes off of that and start to veer to something else, the whole car starts shifting.
So this decision, you look back on as one of the crucial steps away then from your...
I think it was part of a whole getting older. You know, I was in my 20s. You know, I was a woman. I was working. I was earning my own money. It was time for me to decide things for myself and do spiritual reading and exploration. I read about Kabbalah. I tried an Episcopal church. Tried a fundamentalist church. You know, just different things, looking around. And that's a period of time when I was referring to before, when I probably would have answered, I was raised Lutheran, but I'm Christian. And seeking. And maybe the first linchpin for that was not teaching in a Lutheran school, but teaching in a public school, where now you couldn't mention God. You really had to almost avoid religion.
In fact, if you were in your classes, all of a sudden you're having to at least mentally think, well, why do I believe this? Why would I teach this, which would be contrary to the public system of our country? So you're being forced on those issues. Were you being forced with the pro-life, pro-choice issues?
That didn't really come up. I'm an English teacher by profession, so that issue didn't really come up. But in other ways, you were just, because you're there every day, you know, 8 hours a day, and it's not religiously imbued, your atmosphere. So that part of you gets pushed down a little bit. And I see now, definitely, where one choice leads to another. And my faith was strong, but again, it became that sort of walk through life of me and my Bible. And that's all I need, because it's about my personal relationship with Jesus. Well, and, you know, that is really not even Lutheranism anymore. Now that's the old, you know, it's just sola scriptura, sola fide, and you remove those from the liturgy, definitely attending church less frequently at that point. And that sort of detached me. That was the first break away.
Often you might think of an English teacher, English classes as being amoral, but yet the literature that our system is going to recommend, maybe demand that you teach or ignore, does deal, maybe not deal with pro-choice, pro-life, but it deals with morality.
Oh, definitely. And it came down to ignore a lot of times, that I had to keep my own personal feelings, my own personal knowledge out of my teaching methodology. I would also, outside of the classroom, you know, you form personal relationships with your students all the time. Girls would come to me asking me questions about life, and okay, don't tell anyone I said this, but you really can't do that. And I also had really teachers with whom I worked would come to me and say, you know, you seem so joyful all the time. What is your Well, it's not a secret. You know, I'm a Christian. This is my life. I remember I worked with a man who was an atheist, very vocal atheist, and he used to try to butt heads with me all the time and get into debates. And he'd say, you know, sometimes people get uncomfortable with me. I make them question their faith. And I said, no, you're not going to be able to do that with me. Don't worry. So it was definitely a period of time in my life where I was meeting different kinds of people, you know, getting out of that Lutheran culture where everybody's Lutheran. You know, and a lot, I mean, almost everyone I knew was either German, Lutheran, you know, you're kind of sheltered. Now I was meeting all different kinds of people and being forced to defend my faith. And sometimes in that position, you do strip it down to just the skeleton, you know, Bible, love, me and Jesus, you know, I'll just hold on to this. Forget the Lutheranism part.
That's a real common issue. And I'm sure any of our parents out there watching the show know that, because when you're brought up, you have your community, your family, your church. There's some protectiveness in the values you've expressed, but at some point they're going to leave the nest. And so they're out there, but also yourself. There you are, you're in a whole new environment. And this is when your faith is put to the test.
Yeah.
And so would you say, looking back, that your faith in Christ never shook?
That never wavered. That really never wavered.
But the implications of that for your values, choices, other things, started to get eaten away by the pressures from your environment in which you were working?
Well, yeah, because there's no church. There's a church building that you go to, but there was no church with a capital C, which is what I have now. So then, as long as I stuck by Jesus, everything was okay. But it was, again, just me and my Bible.
Were you hearing the Lutheran Church at all during that time give you recommendations on these particular issues that you were being challenged with yourself?
No, there was nothing.
Yeah.
You know, after you leave school, if you're lucky enough to go to a private school, there's no catechesis. There's nothing like that. I mean, there's Bible studies certainly offered in the Lutheran Church, mostly by elderly people. And, you know, later on, as I got a little older, I would go into teaching confirmation, and then I became a little more active again in the Lutheran Church right before I moved to Ohio. But even then, there's a freedom and an elasticity to the teaching, because you really can, you can do a lot with the Bible when there's nobody there to put bumpers around you.
Well, you see it, because you can see where the different Protestant groups have gone on all these issues.
Golly, 33,000 strong and growing every day.
Well, especially in these areas of living together before marriage, what constitutes marriage anymore. They've changed. They're in line with culture, rather than being a voice to culture.
And they're being tricked by, because, you know, secular culture will offer you packages where if you want to care about the poor and you want to care about immigrants and care about the environment, and if that's something you hold in your heart, well, then you also have to buy into these other political causes. Otherwise, you're with the far right and you're closed-minded and you're this. So people buy the whole package. I was never going to buy a whole package. I was an a la carte shopper in my beliefs.
At this place in your journey, you're still in New York, you're teaching English in a high school, you're out there exploring, and you said you and your future husband, does that, where's the next step on that, after that step for you?
Well, when we started thinking about getting married, that was going to be Lutheran. I was going to call that one. So that brought me back onto the Lutheran train.
Where was your husband at?
Raised Catholic, and that's about it. He made all his sacraments, he made his confirmation, but after that, really even in high school, he didn't.
Non-practicing.
Totally non-practicing. And really would have, I think, done whatever I dictated as far as our spiritual life. He knew it was important to me. I was the more religious of the two of us, in every sense of that word.
So uncommon for many couples out there. In
he said, okay, you do that. He came to Lutheran Church, and we started going more, again, to get something out of it. You know, I wanted to get married in that church, so I ramped up the church attendance, and we got back into the wheel. And of course, he didn't have to convert to Lutheranism, because you can just stop by, get married there, and never really commit to anything. And that really brought me back to labeling myself as Lutheran specifically.
That's probably a good point for the audience to know, that a person can start going to the Lutheran Church, never really have to join, can receive
communion.
Communion. There's no, from Sunday to Sunday. There may be some particular local Lutheran churches where the pastor emphasizes membership, but at least in your case.
Yeah, and if anything, in my experience with not just Lutheran churches, but when I would, stop into Methodist or even Episcopal, they were so underattended that it was really like a joke. You'd go in, introduce yourself, and, nice to meet you. Oh, you're a teacher? Do you want to teach Sunday school? It was like they were so desperate for, new bodies that they wanted to pull you into the community in a utilitarian way and use your talents for them. And so they were more than happy. I mean, there was a pre-Cana that we had to go through to get married, but it was very, my pastor at the time just said, well, find a social worker, or we have a social worker we deal with, and you take some lessons about marriage, talk to him a few times, that will qualify. And
a social worker? Mm-hmm. Oh, interesting.
Just to make sure you were prepared for the commitment of marriage. And my pastor knew me, at that point. I was starting to sign up for, like I said, teaching, confirmation. I administered communion, and I became, again, that super active Lutheran.
All right. I'm trying to think of whether the Lutheran Church was going through some of these major upheavals at the time you were becoming more involved at that, or was that later on?
There were murmurings of it, but not yet at that point.
Okay.
That happened later on. What was happening then, especially in that the church that I attended, there was a real bleed of people leaving that church to go to these evangelical rock and roll churches.
Right.
And I remember my pastor saying, funny now, he said, we lose them to that, but it's okay because we get them in from the Catholic Church. So we would lose them to the big stadium churches, the altar calls, falling tongues, the whole thing. But they would get them in from, lapsed Catholics who, for whatever reason, had come up against some teaching that they just did not want to submit to. And
your husband was happy to become Lutheran, or at least to attend Lutheran with you?
He was happy to be pleasing me. He's he's a great guy and a great man, and he loved Jesus. He had that in his heart, and he knew that down the line, raising children, he wanted them to love Jesus. He didn't really care about the frills around that. And he just looked at me and said, you know what, she's got that under control. And his career was amping up, so he had enough to worry about. He was more than happy to delegate that to me. And I was more than happy to take that up because I figured, hey, I'm a professional Lutheran. I can handle this. And so that's what we were for early marriage.
Did you start having a family while you were still Lutheran, or was that later?
Yes, I got pregnant with my daughter, and she was baptized in that very Lutheran church. And there was really no reason to consider anything else at that point. Any of that exploration I was talking about before, first of all, I didn't have time because now I had a baby. And so everything was about that. And that is when really, she at 18 months old would be sitting in the pew, watch me leave from our pew and go put on my robe, and I would process up and administer communion. I was bigly pregnant with my daughter administering communion at the church. So we were then active Lutherans,
all right. Are you at the stage where we should start talking about the Catholic Church, or you still got a long journey yet before you start even considering it?
Well, that's sort of, life went on very quietly for a couple of years, and then my life exploded in a lot of different directions. Everything changed, it feels like all at one time. Just as life often does. My mother got sick. She was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. While she was being treated with chemo, the pressure at my husband's job really increased for us to relocate from New York to Ohio. That obviously had to be on the back burner because my mother was receiving treatment. Everything was... I started to think about having another baby. I was 34, 35 years old, had to move things along. This was on my timing. So,
Did your mother's experience put that pressure on you also?
Yes, yes. And very baldly, I will tell you, I wanted to be pregnant while she was still alive and have her see me, know that I was continuing my family. But that wasn't working out so well because as quickly as I got pregnant with my daughter, it was just not happening. And probably, I was under so much stress watching my mother just destroyed by the combination of the cancer and the chemo, which can do as much, if not more, damage to you physically and mentally and to the whole family.
There's a real trade-off.
And your lives. And I was staying home raising my daughter. My sister was working, my husband was working, so a lot of it fell on me because, you're home. So I was making phone calls, I was helping out, I was driving to and fro. Very pressure-filled time of my life. Again, my faith didn't waver. If anything, Jesus was hauling me along through that. But in that way that we sort of make him what we need him to be at the time. Again, just he was there when I needed him, but kind of in a box. And this was first. All the things that I was trying to do and figure out was first. And then when I needed him, I would pray, and, they would be separate. So life really started to unravel, as happens. My mother went through all of her chemotherapy, and her first scan was clean. Her second scan showed that the cancer was growing again. So the chemo was a waste of time and a waste of much suffering. She was going to die, and I had to face that, which was impossible for me to face. I just couldn't even imagine life without my mother. We were extremely close. She served many functions in my life, not just parent. My parents were divorced, so she was many things for me, and best friend, and helped me care for my daughter. There was just so much there that I was going to lose. And she was suffering so, and there was nothing I could do about that. I would say I relied on my faith less, almost in a way, when it got to that intense point.
Is that because, let me ask you this, is that because, again, I don't want to be critical of Lutheranism, but there wasn't a clear answer of a connect between this suffering
exactly
and my faith.
You hit it so on the head. Nothing in Protestantism, nothing in my theology prepared me for suffering, for having my life blown apart that way. It just didn't. I knew nothing of offering it up. I knew nothing of joining my sufferings with his sufferings on the cross. I certainly knew nothing of Mary. There was no resource there. I would sit with the Bible and do the old, maybe I'll land somewhere and find, maybe he's going to talk to me. And I don't mean to laugh at what some people really cling to, but there was nothing there to prepare me. I had no resources. And so I really was more on my own. And as sometimes happens with life, it went from bad to worse. And, my mother really got to the point where it was imminent. She was going to die. And as you know, in those last maybe 2 weeks before death, really the person changes into something and someone you've never seen before. And I had a 2-year-old little girl that I was caring for. So
You're still in New York during all this time, right?
Still in New York during this time.
Your husband's being lured back to Ohio.
Yeah, that's sort of on the back burner. Okay. But even in a very infant way, we're thinking to ourselves, maybe we would move at some point. We don't know. We even thought about, do we move and take my mom and get her treated there, because Cleveland Clinic is this great hospital. Right. All these things are going through our heads. But the business at hand was watching my mother slip away into what? And then again, my theology was kind of, my mother had not been attending church in recent years. She didn't have a pastor. I asked her, do you want me to bring my pastor? No, I don't want to see anyone. And then she dropped out of that kind of consciousness. She got to a point where she couldn't communicate with us anymore. It really happened in one day. I talked to her on the phone in the morning. She said, when are you coming? And I said, I'm on my way. And by the time I got to her house, she couldn't speak anymore. That capacity had gone. And I said, okay, I've had my last conversation with her. And inside, something in me, just became steel. I had to go through now, handle things. She died. I was still trying to have a baby. It was this sort of automatic pilot where I still have to accomplish this. And phase 2 of my life blowing up was going on because I was miscarrying. And it was really just one of those times in your life when you're like, I don't know if I can really how am I going to get through this?
Yeah, because again, Lutheranism didn't have an answer for miscarriages.
There was
what about
just,
those little human beings?
I had no
those children.
Yeah, there was nothing to prepare me. I was still pondering, where is my mom? I was one of these people who would have told you for the first 35 years of my life, I'm going to heaven. Of course, I believe I'm going to heaven. It was very simple. I was so assured of that, blessed assurance. But something happened. When she died, I had this, well, I hope she did go there. So that was going on in my head.
Go there, the wrong place, is what you meant. Yeah, I hope she didn't go to...
I just didn't know anymore. Everything was kind of in doubt. And I had 3 miscarriages in the space of a year. I was really at I would say my lowest. In a life review, I would say, that was my lowest point. I remember a point where I was taking care of my little girl during the day, and I had miscarried for a 3rd time. And my mom was gone, and nobody in my family was really doing much talking about. We had kind of a stoical.
All this?
Well, he was trying his best, but boy, oh boy, it's not easy with a German like me, because I didn't want to express any emotion. I was trying to just, carry on and not drop a stitch during the whole thing. I had to put on the happy face for my daughter.
Well, let's pause with that happy face.
Yeah.
Take our break right now, and then we'll come back and see again, how the Lord kind of got you out of that mess.
Because that was a turning point.
All right, good. We'll come back in just a moment. See you in a bit. Welcome back to the Journey Home. Our guest tonight is Nicole DeMille, and we've kind of left you right at one of those low periods in your journey. But it really is important that the Lord uses a great variety of things to get our attention. And maybe it's because of our individual characters. Sometimes it's a really high, sometimes it's a really low. But our Lord in His loving mercy knows exactly what it is that each of us need to turn our hearts towards Him. So we've kind of left you in this stage where, you've had some miscarriages, you've lost your mother, which I often believe that you don't realize how important your parents are until you lose them. That's the way I felt about when I lost my father.
Yeah, I didn't think I knew, I had thought, as a little girl sometimes I would tell me, I can't imagine if I didn't have you. But, you just don't think about it. And she was only 64. When she died, and it happened so quickly. Young. She got sick, she was diagnosed, and a year later she was gone. And it was a very intense year of suffering, and I saw things that I couldn't really process. And after she died, I really didn't take care of the business of processing those things. I was raising my daughter, we had decisions to make about life. I was trying to get back into the business of just living and looking at preschools for my daughter, and I just had to keep going. And everybody else seemed to do okay. Everybody in my family was doing better than I was. But a lot of my suffering was inside. I was trying to maintain a certain facade of control. My husband would try to help me. And I would say, you know what, really, I don't want to talk about it. I'll be okay.
So what happened? You're still in New York, right?
Still in New York. Went on like that to a bit, and then the relocation possibility came up again in a very big way through my husband's job. The economy at this time was starting to really go downhill. So when they offered him something, we said, you know what, in an economy like this, you don't tell them what you're doing. You say, okay, let's go. And frankly, I said to him very blandly, my mother's dead. I don't care where I live now. My heart was kind of icebox-ish at this point, where it's like, okay, I don't care anymore. She's not here. My parents were already divorced, so my dad lived half the year in Florida, half the year in Vermont. My sister moved to Florida. I had a stepfather. It was just one of those things where I was like, I have nothing, so we'll go. So we moved to Ohio. Big culture shock for a city girl from Queens, New York, to now go to Ohio. And I was prepared to dislike it. And secretly, in my secret mind, it was just going to be a stopover, and we would stay there for a little bit, and then I would get my husband down to Florida to live near my sister. That was my secret plan. But it didn't work out that way. I really hated Ohio the first few months. The good news was I got pregnant, was pregnant with my son. I was overjoyed about that. And that buoyed me up and took me out of my funk because I wasn't thinking about, you know, you have life growing inside of you. You're not thinking clearly about anything. So life sort of seemed, you know, on a trajectory. I had my son in Ohio. He was born in Ohio. We settled in Chagrin Falls. Things were moving along at a pretty good clip. The winter came. That was...
You found a spiritual home?
We found a small Lutheran church in Chagrin Falls. My son was baptized in the Lutheran church. Okay. Lutheranism carries on. We found a little Christian pre-K for my daughter that was attached to the Lutheran church, and everything was fine. And I had my daughter enrolled for kindergarten in a Christian school, a non-denominational Christian school. So that was taken care of until we got the handbook from that Christian school. And as I'm reading, as any good parent would, before I sign on the dotted line, I see that in this non-denominational Christian school, they have a paddling policy. And by paddling, if anyone is unfamiliar with that, it is a form of discipline where the principal calls the student into his office and he has a paddle hanging on the wall, and the student assumes the position and is paddled on the rear end. And, well, I about fell over. I couldn't believe it. My husband was...
So you're not of the generation. I remember experiencing that from my principal.
Golly. I'm so sorry.
No,
Morgan.
no,
I don't want to bring up any bad memories.
No. I deserved every bit of it.
We were mortified. Our little 4-year-old. How could we send her to this paddling school, as we came to term it? So I went right to the principal and we talked about it, and I hung on a hope that maybe this was some archaic thing that was left in the handbook and they never took it out and they were going to remove it now, of course, because who would ever sign up for this sort of thing? I was sort of had a nugget of familiarity with it because way back when I was exploring, I had remembered that one of the things that was distasteful to me about some of these evangelical groups was that they really seemed obsessed with spare the rod, spoil the child. And they kind of hung this whole...
Well, the hard thing is, that's what the Bible says. I mean, there's definitely, you look in the book of Proverbs. So how do you make a balance on that? Right. And when you're left to Scripture alone without the guidance of the church to understand its context, then it's
Sola
hard.
Scriptura came and paddled me.
Right.
So I had to get out of this or figure this out. Well, then there was no school to send her to. And the Lutheran schools were on the west side of Cleveland. I was on the east side of Cleveland. And it was a 40-minute, so we really didn't know what to do. And it was my husband who said to me, well, what about, there's a little Catholic church up the road. Maybe there's a school there. It's only for kindergarten while you figure something else. You know, how much damage could they do? Why don't you go and check it out? So he was really the one, in a weird way, who started it. And I went, I checked it out, and there was Mary in the hallway, but there was Jesus, and I was, okay, everything's going to be all right. Met the principal, and I liked what I saw. It reminded me of the little Lutheran school I went to growing up. So this felt like the right thing to do. So I enrolled her. She was going to Catholic school for kindergarten. Well, I'm a good mother in this way anyway. I have to research what they're going to be teaching her, because if she comes home learning the Hail Mary, I have to know what this is, what I'm talking about. So let me just research Catholic theology enough so I can cover kindergarten and I'll know what's going on there. Well, something very unexpected happened while I was doing that research. I learned some things that I didn't necessarily want to know. One by one, all of the misconceptions, the rumors, the urban legends, the things that nobody could ever tell me before started unraveling. They were not real teachings. They were things that everything had an explanation. And even scriptures that I knew before, but never, this is my body given for you. I said, this is my body. This is my body. I mean, I was really getting worried that Catholics had a point. And it was a very short period of time, and I started, the internet. What a godsend. I mean, the information is there. EWTN was another thing that was a culprit. Kept on sucking me in. And there's also an organization, the Catholic Truth Society, CTS. They're out of England. Ordered a bunch of pamphlets from them. Well, before you know it, the reading and the research caught up with me. And one night my husband came home from work, and I was sitting on the couch just surrounded by notebooks and books and printouts from the computer. And he was, what are you doing? And I said, I have to tell you something. And he said, okay. And I said, yeah, I'm becoming Catholic. And so we all are. This is what we're all doing. He was like, what? And I said, what? I mean, he was so thrown off, but he was sort of okay, because again, I'm still the spiritual driver for the family. And if anything, his career has amped up even more, where he's just working so many hours. I mean, this is his defining characteristic. He's a hard worker. And I said, okay, so this is, and it all just started there in that very strange way. And we went and met with the priest of this small Catholic church and Catholic school, and we had to find out what we had to do to have our marriage blessed, because we were married in the Lutheran church. And we had to write to Bishop Lennon and have our marriage blessed in the church. I found out that the kids' baptisms were fine because they were Christian baptisms, and my daughter had not yet hit the age of reason, and she could have her first communion in the Catholic Church. And while that was going on, I was still doing my studying at home. And then I met with Sister Anne Marie, who led the RCIA at this church, at St. Joan of Arc Church in Chagrin Falls. And Sister Anne Marie was my first nun. I really never knew a nun before. I didn't know what to expect. And she was just fabulous. She was so key to my conversion. And the RCIA group was full of people, the likes of which I had never met before. They were happy, active, daily mass attenders, educated Catholics. And so much of their life revolved around being Catholic. And they knew all the answers to the Catholic questions. And one by one, just everything started to fall into place. Any doubts that I had about teachings that seemed spurious or extra-biblical or man-made, all the things that I hadn't understood, one by one got answered. And every time I went to RCIA, I would come home being more and more sure that I was coming home. I mean, it's a cliche. It's become a cliche now in conversion circles for a reason. Because I got closer to that goal, and every week I was more sure of it. And at the same time, attending Mass, not being able to receive. And I remember in the Lutheran church, I was handing out the communion, and I'm in the back of the church watching everybody else go up to receive, and I'm, sitting there.
Did you have to struggle with that for a while?
Oh, it was really painful. I would cry in the pew, and it was so hard for my husband. He was like, you sure you don't want to go back to the, and I said, no, they don't have it there.
But was he being receptive to the return to the Catholic Church?
He was really growing in, sort of a strange way, because he was being re-catechized through the materials that I was, and I would say to him, where do you stand on, scapulars and something? He'd be like, what? He hadn't been taught a lot. So, we were learning together, and that was a great thing too, for our marriage, for our family. We were all sort of making the trip together. And, like I said, the closer April came, and that night that everything was going to come to fruition, I just got more and more certain. And any doubt I had, any question I had, that RCIA team, boy oh boy, they were really there. And at the same time, I'm discovering things online, blogs by Catholic bloggers, I mean, Pat Madrid and Scott Hahn, Mark Shea, Dave Armstrong. I mean, just countless people who had this life of faith and had answers, not from within themselves, answers from the church. And I remember saying to Sister Anne Marie one night, and she just laughed at me. I said, "Did you know the Vatican has a website?" She's, "Well, yeah." I said, "But it's all there, encyclicals." And then I started to wonder, how do Catholics not know what the teachings are? They're all there, right at their fingertips. I don't get this. So I went through that sort of period too, where I was like, I don't get these lukewarm Catholics. How do they not realize what they have? The Eucharist, it was blowing my mind. And, you know, during this time also, I found a Catholic counselor, grief counselor, and she helped me through a lot of the grief that I wasn't processing with my mom. And already, you know, Catholicism was informing my decisions, because when it came time to look for a counselor, I didn't just go to some secular guy who was educated in, you know, the Poison Ivy Leagues. I went to a Catholic counselor, and she understood my questions, and we could talk about things like purgatory, and that you certainly couldn't talk about.
What would you say was the most difficult hurdle? What was it, leaving things that had been so tight always your life in Lutheranism, or were there Catholic issues that stood in the way?
You know, I didn't struggle with a lot of the common, you know, the hurdles that people talk about.
Yeah.
Mary was not a problem for me, because I was guided in
once you understood
by
the teaching of the church.
Yeah, and then you know, even before that, and again, one of those weird moments that you look back on, when the movie The Passion of the Christ came out, and there was, you know, the way that movie was done, you really saw a Marian perspective in a way that I hadn't looked at before. And I was a mother, don't forget. So now, you know, that helped too. And there was a scene in Passion of the Christ where Christ is walking, carrying the cross, the stations of the cross were being carried out. And Mary is just, the suffering that she's going through is palpable. And the actress just portrays it so well. And she starts flashing back to when Jesus was a boy. So they're playing these two scenes at the same time. Jesus is a grown man carrying his cross, and he's bloody. And he stumbles under the cross. And at the same time, she thinks back to when he was a boy, and he fell. And he falls at the same time in both scenes, and she said, "Yeshua," and she calls out to her son. And as a mother, as a Christian, that was it. You know, that did me in. And you understand then, she was his mother. What have I been thinking? How did we just have her off to the side? Almost like she was just this accidental place where, they used her womb for a while. What was that? How did I not see that? How did I not elevate her? And then to read, even more shocking, Martin Luther revered her, loved her, but, you know, in these efforts to distance Protestantism from Catholicism, boy, the sacrifices they had to make, the things they had to lose. What a shame. What a shame.
Even Luther was trying desperately to argue for a sense of the real presence against the other reformers. He had to back off from the philosophical understanding of it and coming up with a consubstantiation description of that. But then it was the second, third, and fourth generation Lutheran scholars that distanced more and more from
and to where we are today, it just could not be, unfortunately, any more apart.
Let's take an email here while we've got some time. I've got a couple of questions I'd love to ask, but let's let some of the audience ask.
Okay.
Denise from Wichita, why is it that Catholics think they need a church to interpret the Bible? All Christians need is a love of Scripture, and God will reveal His truth to them through the inspired words.
That's such an important question for me, especially now as a mom raising kids and the kind of world I'm going to have to unleash them into. I paused to shudder for a second, Marcus. That when you just have you and your Bible, and I often say I was sometimes even maybe a little bit practicing like bibliolatry, like almost worshiped that Bible. Like, you know, I just looked to that. I'm going to give myself the advantage. You know, I mean, conveniently, when we create a Jesus for ourselves, conveniently, he seems to kind of allow the sins that we like to commit and get angry about the ones that we don't have any trouble with. And there are some questions that just can't be answered by the Bible alone. It just can't happen. Things that are cropping up now. You know, and the lives of the saints that the church introduces us to, they've been so valuable to me through my conversion, through getting over my mom's death, through adapting to a new place, just situations that you enter in, in daily life. I have so many resources now. Now I have the opposite problem, where I'm like, when am I going to get time to do all of the spiritual reading that I want to do? I'll never forget when I got the catechism in the mail. I was used to the Lutheran catechism, which is a pamphlet. I ordered the Catholic catechism quickly online. It comes to the house. It's like 800 pages. I'm like, oh boy. But it's that big for a reason. It's all covered.
The interconnectivity. I mean, even you referenced your own journey where, for that time period, your husband-to-be and you had made the decision that it's okay to live together.
Yeah.
All right, it's okay to live together. Well, it's easy for us always to read into the Bible what we want it to say, especially when we're in a culture or with other Christians that have all done the same thing. Or even the most conservative Christians that have their little verses, like, as opposed to understanding that maybe corporal punishment of children, there's a place for it, but there's got to be within a context of understanding it, as opposed to, this is what that verse says, I'm going to do it. And so we end up with really radical examples.
And really, at bottom, Marcus, if you're going to heaven no matter what you do anyway, are you really that worried? And that's a big thing that has changed my understanding of that.
The difference between Luther's understanding of the total depravity of the will, you're always a sinner covered with imputed grace, as opposed to the Catholic Church understanding our wills are wounded, of course. And we're tempted by concupiscence all the time.
And reading about that was
we're empowered by grace to grow in holiness.
Goodness.
Email Samantha from Connecticut. Has Nicole's reception into the Catholic Church enriched her understanding of marriage?
Oh, definitely. It's it's a sacrament, again, for a reason. And when you look at the family as being the domestic church, you see how it helps you in an embattled kind of world, how to go out and face what you encounter. Because every day there's some new way that the world is going to tell you that live and let live, do whatever you want, it's just fine. Every day you're presented with temptations, injustices, questions. If you can go home to a husband who is in line with you, and you're raising your kids in that faith, and you're at Mass, and you're receiving together, you're going to confession together. I mean, my husband and I go to confession together. That's something that I never would have seen the value of, honestly, as a Lutheran. I didn't understand what it was for. And now I can't imagine being without it.
Well, we live in a country where all these major moral issues have become political issues.
Well, that's the problem.
Where the candidates are trying to win votes, and who you're going to give in to, and who you're going to represent, and the pressures. And of course, the trajectory is almost always in the more left progressive direction, because it seems to get the most votes. I mean,
well, and it's always about, it's pride, again, is the killer. It's the root of all the sins, because it's I. If I've, it's very Nietzschean, to kill God and then I am God. If you've taken down the church and deconstructed that, and God is just an old grandfather who's like, oh, you kids, do whatever you want down there, you come up to heaven anyway. If that's your authority system, now you can make yourself the final authority. Well, isn't that convenient? Because again, you're writing all the rules as you go. And you can conveniently bring in some scripture when you need it, like judge not, lest ye be judged, and throw that around. And that, shut them up on the right, and that's the end of that. But it's not that simple. And, when you have a church behind you and a theology behind you that has reasons and writings that are as old as Jesus, going back to Peter, that blew my mind when I found out that Pope Benedict could be traced all the way back to Peter, the Apostolic Church. And I said, 4 marks of the Church, one Holy Catholic Apostolic. Yeah, I'm saying it. It's the Nicene Creed. I'm saying it as a Lutheran, but not understanding what it means.
A disconnect from what it meant when it was written.
Crazy.
Well, Nicole, thank you so much for joining us on the
Thank
journey.
you.
Sharing your story. It's always hard to combine the whole, to condense the whole thing into. But you've done a fine job in helping us understand your journey.
Thank you.
As a mother and as a wife and as a grieving daughter, and how the Lord used all that to open your heart to the beauty of His church.
Thank you for the opportunity.
All right. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. I hope Nicole's story and journey was encouragement to you, and also to those of you parents that hope that your own children can find their way back. Keep praying for them. God can do miracles. God bless. See you soon.